My parents stole my $47K college fund for my brother's startup, so years later, I secretly bought their mortgage and foreclosed on them. From the age of 16, I worked 2 jobs so I wouldn't be a burden on my parents' modest income. I saved every tip, every bonus, every birthday check, $47,000 in total, into a dedicated college fund. I dreamed of becoming an engineer, of building something real with my own hands. But when I turned 18 and opened my savings account statement, the balance read 0. My parents had quietly drained it all to invest in my younger brother's revolutionary food truck idea, a business that folded in 6 months. They told me I was resilient and could figure it out. What they didn't know was that I'd already figured out how to ensure their golden boy's failure would cost them far more than just money, and that their comfortable retirement was now entirely in my hands. Our house in suburban Ohio always smelled faintly of mildew and microwave dinners. My father worked as a mid-level insurance adjuster, and my mother taught part-time at the local community center. Money was never abundant, but it was stable. Until my brother Ethan came along. He was 8 years younger than me, born when I was already in middle school, and from the moment he could talk, he was treated like a prodigy. Not because he was particularly gifted, but because my parents decided early on that he deserved every opportunity I never got. I didn't resent him for it, not at first. I just accepted that my role was to be quiet, responsible, and self-sufficient. By high school, I was working weekends at a diner and weekday evenings shelving books at the public library. I lived off instant ramen and thrift store clothes. Funneling every spare dollar into a high-yield savings account my guidance counselor helped me open. The bank statements became my secret treasure maps. $5,000 by junior year, $28,000 by graduation. I even received a partial scholarship to a state engineering program, which meant my savings would cover housing, books, and lab fees. I remember printing out my acceptance letter and taping it to my bedroom mirror. For the first time, I let myself believe I could escape the cycle of scarcity that defined my childhood. Then came the summer after graduation. I was packing boxes for my dorm when my mother called me into the living room. She sat on the floral couch, twisting her wedding ring nervously. My father stood by the window, arms crossed, avoiding my gaze. Ethan lounged on the recliner, scrolling through his phone with a smug half-smile. My mother explained, voice trembling slightly, that Ethan had pitched an incredible business idea to them, a gourmet grilled cheese food truck with disruptive potential. He'd secured a spot at a trendy downtown market, but needed startup capital. They'd looked at their options and, well, my college fund seemed like the most logical source. After all, I was so resourceful, and engineering degrees were expensive and uncertain. They'd pay me back once the business took off. I stared at them, my stomach dropping like a stone. I asked to see the account. My father handed me his laptop. The transaction history showed a single withdrawal, $47,312.89, transferred 3 weeks prior to an LLC registered under Ethan's name. There was no promissory note, no repayment plan, just a clean digital erasure of 4 years of my labor. I didn't cry. I just nodded, packed my remaining clothes into a duffel bag, and walked to the bus stop. I enrolled in night classes at the community college, working full-time as a warehouse packer. I slept 4 hours a night and ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. Meanwhile, Ethan's food truck, Cheesy Dreams, launched with a splashy Instagram campaign. My parents posted about it constantly, calling him a visionary entrepreneur. I stopped speaking to them entirely. 5 years passed. I graduated with honors, landed a job at a civil engineering firm, and slowly rebuilt my financial life. I bought a small condo, paid off my student loans, and started investing. I heard through distant relatives that Cheesy Dreams had shut down after a health code violation and a failed attempt to expand into frozen snacks. My parents, now in their late 50s, had begun talking about early retirement. They'd sold their house and planned to move to a lakeside community in Michigan, living off their modest 401k and Social Security. They'd even sent me a passive-aggressive holiday card last year that read, "Hope you found your path. We're finally relaxing." Then, last month, I got a call from a mortgage broker I used to work with during a side gig in real estate analytics. He mentioned a curious case, a couple in their late 50s trying to refinance their new lake house, but their credit was shot due to a string of bad investments, including a failed LLC tied to a food truck. They were desperate. Their only asset was the equity in the new property. But lenders were wary. He asked if I knew anyone who might be interested in private lending. I smiled and said, "Actually, I might be." That evening, I pulled up the property records. The address matched the lakeside home my parents had bragged about online. And the primary borrower? My father. I opened my investment portfolio app and checked my liquid assets. I had more than enough to buy their mortgage note outright. if I chose to. The question wasn't whether I could do it. It was whether I should. I didn't hesitate for a single second. The next morning, I contacted the mortgage broker and instructed him to initiate the purchase of the note. The process was surprisingly straightforward, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil I had endured years ago. The original retail bank was eager to offload the non-performing asset, especially since my parents were already 2 payments behind and showing no signs of catching up. I wired the funds from my diversified investment accounts, watching the digital confirmation populate on my screen. By the end of the week, the mortgage was officially transferred to a newly formed limited liability company I had created specifically for this purpose, Horizon Asset Management. I was no longer just their estranged, overlooked daughter. I was their primary creditor. I set up a professional P.O. box in a neighboring city, established a dedicated email address, and hired a meticulous virtual assistant to handle the initial correspondence. I wanted the communication to be strictly business, entirely devoid of any personal emotion or familial history. Every email sent to my parents was polite, firm, and completely unyielding. I watched the digital read receipts, knowing they were staring at their screens, wondering who this ruthless corporate entity was that now held the deed to their dream retirement. For the first 2 months, I maintained a strict, impenetrable professional distance. My virtual assistant sent the monthly statements, complete with late fees that accumulated with cold, mathematical precision. My parents, accustomed to the lenient grace periods and forgiving customer service of their previous bank, were thrown into an absolute panic. They began leaving frantic, lengthy voicemails at the Horizon Asset Management office, pleading for a temporary deferment. They claimed that a minor cash flow issue with a new artisanal catering venture, Ethan's latest brilliant idea, had temporarily depleted their liquid reserves. Listening to those voicemails in the quiet sanctuary of my own condo was a profoundly surreal experience. My mother's voice, usually so sharp, critical, and dismissive when speaking to me, was now thick with a desperate, trembling anxiety. She talked about how hard they had worked their entire lives, how they deserved a break in their golden years, and how this faceless corporation was being entirely unreasonable and cruel. I forwarded the audio files to a private, encrypted folder on my computer, archiving them as a permanent reminder of the reality they were trying so desperately to hide. I formally denied the deferment request, citing strict institutional underwriting guidelines. I required a comprehensive hardship application, complete with 3 months of bank statements, full tax returns, and a complete disclosure of all assets and liabilities. They had absolutely no choice but to comply and hand over their financial souls. The drive up the interstate gave me time to reflect on the sheer irony of the situation as I prepared for their holiday invitation. They still viewed me through the lens of the past, assuming I was barely scraping by in a cubicle. They had no idea that my engineering firm specialized in commercial real estate development, or that my recent promotion had come with a substantial stock option package. They had written me off as the backup plan, the reliable safety net that would always be there to catch them when they fell. I thought about the late nights I had spent studying structural loads and material sciences, while they were posting pictures of Ethan's food truck on social media. I had built my career brick by brick, just like I had tried to build our family. Now I was about to inspect the foundation of their retirement and find it entirely hollow. The autumn trees lining the highway were shedding their leaves, a visual reminder of things coming to an end. I turned up the radio, letting the music fill the car, and focused on the road ahead. The tension reached a critical boiling point in late November when my mother called my personal cell phone directly, bypassing the management company entirely. It was the first time she had initiated contact in over a year. Her tone was artificially bright, heavily masking the underlying panic. She invited me to the lake house for Thanksgiving, insisting it was time to put the past behind us and rebuild our family bond. I knew exactly what this invitation truly was. They were completely cornered. The hardship application had revealed the true, devastating extent of their financial mismanagement, and the bank, meaning me, was preparing to call the loan due and initiate foreclosure proceedings. I agreed to attend, driving the rest of the way with a calm, focused mindset. When I arrived, the house was immaculately decorated for the holiday, featuring elaborate centerpieces and expensive candles, but the atmosphere inside was incredibly brittle. My father poured me a glass of wine with a slightly trembling hand, avoiding my gaze. Ethan was there, of course, lounging on the sectional sofa, scrolling through his phone while wearing a luxury watch that cost more than my first car. They made polite, superficial small talk about the weather and the neighborhood, carefully avoiding the massive elephant in the room. During the meal, The conversation was a masterclass in deflection. My mother praised the quality of the cranberry sauce, while my father discussed the upcoming winter boating season. Ethan chimed in only to complain about the supply chain issues affecting his new import business. I listened quietly, nodding at the appropriate moments, taking small bites of my food. I observed the subtle signs of their stress, my father's frequent glances at his phone, my mother's tight, forced smiles, the way Ethan kept tapping his foot against the hardwood floor. They were living in a house of cards and the wind was already blowing. When my mother brought out the pumpkin pie, she let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for sympathy. She mentioned how exhausting it was to manage the property, how the property taxes had increased, and how the mysterious new mortgage holder was making their lives a living nightmare. She asked if I knew anyone in the banking industry who could put in a good word for them. After the dry turkey and tense silence of dinner, my father cleared his throat and set his crystal glass down on a cork coaster. He launched into a heavily rehearsed speech about family being there for each other in tough times. He explained that Horizon Asset Management was being incredibly harsh, threatening foreclosure over a temporary shortfall. He asked if I would be willing to co-sign a personal loan to pay off the mortgage, or if I could simply lend them the $50,000 they needed to cure the default. My mother chimed in, adding that I was doing very well in my engineering job and wouldn't even miss the money. Ethan finally looked up from his phone, offering a smug, entitled smile, suggesting I could just write it off as an early inheritance. I set my wine glass down, the soft clink echoing in the quiet, tense room. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out a single, thick document. I slid it across the polished mahogany dining table, stopping it right in front of my father. I looked him directly in the eye and told him to read the signature on the promissory note at the bottom of the page. My father adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the bottom of the page. The silence in the dining room stretched so thin I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each swing of the pendulum marking the passing of their comfortable illusion. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. The crystal chandelier above us cast a harsh, unforgiving light on his graying hair. My mother leaned over, asking what the document was, her voice tight with impatience and a growing edge of panic. I waited, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. Finally, my father looked up, his face pale and his hands shaking. He looked at me, then back at the paper, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. I leaned forward and gently took the document from his trembling fingers. I explained in a steady, even tone that Horizon Asset Management was not a faceless corporation. It was a limited liability company I had established 3 years ago. I was the sole managing member, and the signature at the bottom of the promissory note was mine. The color drained completely from my mother's face, leaving her looking fragile and suddenly very old. She stared at me as if I were a stranger who had broken into her home and stolen her silverware. She stammered, asking why I would buy their mortgage, why I would hide my identity, and why I was threatening to take their house. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the cool liquid ground me against the rising heat of their outrage. I reminded her that they had threatened to take my future when they drained my college fund. I detailed the exact amount they had stolen from me, $47,312. I explained that when they transferred my savings to Ethan's failing food truck, they made a conscious decision to prioritize his fleeting whims over my education and security. They had told me I was resilient, that I would figure it out. I told them I had figured it out. I had built a highly successful career in commercial real estate and asset management. I had the capital to purchase their distressed mortgage note, and I had the legal right to enforce its terms. Ethan finally looked up from his phone, his smug expression entirely replaced by confusion and rising panic. He asked if I was going to forgive the debt since we were family and blood was supposed to matter. I turned my gaze to him, noting the expensive watch on his wrist that he definitely couldn't afford on his own. I told him that family was exactly why I was doing this. I had learned a very hard lesson about relying on family for financial security. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. My father slammed his hand on the table, rattling the fine china and sending a silver fork clattering to the floor. He raised his voice, calling me vindictive and cruel. He said I was punishing them for a mistake they made years ago, and that a good daughter would just write off the loan and let them retire in peace. I looked at him calmly and informed him that a good daughter wouldn't have had her life savings stolen in the first place. This wasn't about punishment. It was about basic contract law. They had signed a legally binding agreement, and they had failed to uphold their end of it. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and entirely by the book. I didn't drag it out for emotional satisfaction. I handled it with the same clinical efficiency I applied to my commercial projects. Since they could not cure the default and refused to negotiate a short sale, I initiated formal foreclosure proceedings. My parents hired a lawyer, but the paperwork was ironclad. They had missed multiple payments, failed the hardship requirements, and defaulted on the terms they themselves had signed. The local newspaper published the notice of the sheriff's sale for 3 consecutive weeks. On the morning of the auction, I didn't even have to attend in person. My attorney placed the winning bid on my behalf, purchasing the lake house for the exact amount of the outstanding debt plus legal fees and penalties. The house was officially mine, free and clear. The day they had to vacate the property was overcast and bitterly cold, the wind whipping off the lake and rattling the bare branches of the oak trees. I drove past the house one last time while they were moving their belongings into a rented U-Haul. My mother was crying, wrapping fragile items in newspaper and loading them into cardboard boxes. My father looked 10 years older. His shoulders slumped in defeat as he taped up the last carton. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he had moved back to the city to find himself after his latest import business went under. I didn't stop the truck. I didn't offer to help them carry the boxes or say goodbye. I just drove past, the heater blasting in my car, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. I sold the lake house a month later to a private developer who wanted to tear it down and build a multifamily rental complex. The profit from the sale was substantial, completely covering the original debt and then some. I donated the surplus to a scholarship fund for first-generation engineering students at my old community college, ensuring they would never have to compromise their dreams due to a lack of funds. My relationship with my parents is now strictly limited to a brief phone call on major holidays. The conversations are polite, superficial, and entirely devoid of the entitlement they used to project. They never ask for money, and they never mention Ethan's various failed ventures. They have learned, perhaps too late, that actions have consequences and that love cannot be used as a currency to buy forgiveness. I still live in the city, but I recently upgraded to a beautiful penthouse overlooking the skyline. The view reminds me of how far I've climbed. Every morning, I look out at the horizon and think about the young girl who worked double shifts and ate peanut butter sandwiches so she could build a better life. She didn't just survive, she thrived. She took the pain of their betrayal and forged it into an unbreakable foundation. I finally have the security they tried to take from me, and no one can ever take it away again.